is lecture 6.1. Here we are discussing poverty in the social structure. So we're going to be talking about the macro level social theory surrounding poverty, and then we'll talk about how theory relates to poverty solutions. So just kind of a reminder from Social 101, sociological theories are broken into three general schools of thought. We have functionalism on the macro level, conflict theory on the macro level, and then symbolic interactionism tends to be on the micro level. Structural functionalism states that society is a series of interconnected parts or structures, and each structure serves a function and is interdependent on the other structures. So within functionalism, something exists if it serves a purpose, right? So you could ask from this theoretical perspective, what purpose does poverty serve? You could say that poverty serves to give social workers jobs. That's over 26,000 people just in Ohio are social workers. Poverty also serves to give an example of what will happen if you don't work hard. That sounds very cruel, and sometimes poverty functionalism can be a bit cruel. Poverty then also serves to fill the low-paying jobs that others don't want to do. So how do you get people to work at McDonald's? How do you get people to do dangerous jobs? You make sure some people are poor. An alternate interpretation, because, I mean, honestly, the early functionalist explanations were very cruel. Contemporary functionalists acknowledge that some aspects of society may not actually serve a purpose, and those things that do not serve a purpose are then labeled as dysfunctions. So you can look at some social institution such as slavery in the, segregation in the United States was dysfunctional. The functionalist argument then being made that poverty is a dysfunction of some social structure in society, maybe the free market, right? So segregation as it existed in the South did serve a function of, I suppose, maintaining a certain degree of social stability in that society at the time. However, it also was greatly dysfunctional in its oppression of black people and a lot of other people as well. So the dysfunction of that institution eventually became so overwhelming that segregation went away. It could very well be that poverty becomes so much of a dysfunction in our society that we may do something to try to eliminate it entirely as well. There have been efforts to do that in the past, not really as much recently, but that is within the realm of possibility in terms of the social world. A critique of functionalism is that there is to ask, are problematic elements in our society actually functional, or are they merely upholding the status quo? This is risen by the critique, the age-old critique of functionalism. Okay, it's functional for who? Sociologists who study conflict theory usually bring that up, right? In other words, does the suffering of the poor actually benefit people who are in power? And is the illusion of benefiting people in power actually what you're calling the function? It's a really interesting question that's brought up is, can we have hundreds of billionaires without creating many thousands of poor people? And if you just do the simple math of how an economy works is no. We should be deeply distressed by, right now in the United States, we have the most billionaires we have ever had. For every billionaire, there has to be so many people who have absolutely nothing. From a conflict theorist perspective, the social dynamics of society are reliant on the interplay between haves and have-nots. Conflict theory is based on the work of Karl Marx. I don't know why that's a question mark. That's a fact. And Karl Marx was a philosopher, historian, and economist who was greatly influential on the social sciences and political philosophy. I like to lay out the difference between the two terms Marxist and Marxian. Marxist refers to political thought and philosophy based on Marx's ideas, while Marxian is a term for social scientific theory that's based on Marx's ideas. So when we are using Marx's ideas in sociology, they are Marxian. When somebody's talking about political theory, say in a meeting of socialists, then you're talking about Marxist ideas. So from this perspective, the status quo of how i.e. how things normally work in society is that the bourgeoisie, the owners, have more power than the proletariat, the workers. And we really see this dynamic a lot in books like Nomadland, for example. And in having more power, the bourgeoisie are able to make the proletariat work harder for longer hours with fewer benefits. And this is all done in the name of profit. And in fact, we are trained by society not to question that social order. And if we do question that order, we may be labeled as a troublemaker. And I certainly have experienced that myself. I was fired from a online teaching position because I was the president of the local union down there, and the dean of that particular college found a cool little loophole through which he could fire me, and he did. Yeah, that's a whole other story, though. So let's define this bourgeoisie thing, right? Because as people talk more about Marx's ideas in our society, we start to use these words more. The bourgeoisie, so the capitalist class, that's the noun, and then bourgeois is the adjective, right? So you can have a hyper-rich uncle who is a member of the bourgeoisie, and then you could talk about that uncle by saying, oh, my bourgeois uncle, for example. The bourgeoisie are the people in our society who control the means of production. So that is the things in society that are used to make other things, such as farmland, a factory, a restaurant, sewing machines, all that stuff that makes other stuff, that's the means of production. And recently in the United States, this group has started to be referred to as the 1%. And when I say recently, I mean the last 20 years. So here we see kind of some illustrations via kind of a clumsy political cartoon. I don't really love the cartoons that label like figures with who they are, but the idea that there are big, plump CEOs and workers who are barely making ends meet, that is very much a conflict theorist kind of idea. And if you look at ideas espoused by people like Bernie Sanders and other similar politicians, they're talking about conflict theorist ideas. So who are the proletariat? In terms of nouns, the working class is the proletariat class, and then the adjective is proletarian. So your working class uncle is a proletariat, while if the going bowling after work is proletarian. That's not used as much as the whole bourgeoisie thing. These are the people who sell their labor to the bourgeoisie in exchange for their wages. So we, proletariat, and all of us, probably everybody watching this lecture, is proletariat by these very definitions. Our American concept of what is the working class is a little bit different than the Marxian idea of working class. Marx would classify everybody who does not own like their own business, more or less, as being proletariat. Anyone who works for anyone else, Marx would say, is proletariat. While the only people who are in the bourgeoisie are like the people at the tippy top, basically. Marx observes that the proletariat are actually incredibly powerful because they can stop all production in society if they wish. There are simply more of us than there are of them, right? And so we could all just stop working if we wanted to and demand to be paid more if we wanted to. And that's what a strike is. Based on the interpretation of that theory, then, as I alluded to, the proletariat includes poor, working class, and middle class workers. That's more of Marx's idea than really breaking up what is middle class and what is working class. From Marx's idea, it's all working class. But you could ask the question, why exactly do the employers exploit the workers? And as Marx explains in his kind of masterwork, Das Kapital, employers pay workers just enough to keep them satisfied so that they can maximize their surplus labor. Surplus labor is the profit generated for an employer in a shift after the worker has paid for their own wages. Let me look at my next slide just for a second. Yeah, here's an example. Your job is to put together IKEA bookshelves, and this is actually an emerging type of work in our economy. So you can be paid $10 an hour and work for 8 hours. And each day, your work costs the boss $80 if you're working at $10 an hour. And you can put one set of these shelves together in 1 hour. This service costs the customer $40, right? Remember when you were only working for $10 an hour. The boss pockets that extra $30. Thus, you generate the boss $320 per day, but you are only paid $80 a day. Thus, the surplus value there being the boss pockets $240 thanks to you every day. The surplus value of work is $240 a day, and this is how much I just said that. You can also, the capitalist uses this term profit margin, right? Now, obviously, part of the surplus value goes into buying tools and workspace and paying the heating and all that. But when you break out surplus value, it is always absolutely in favor of the boss. That's the Marxian idea of looking at it. So by suppressing, how do they get away with it is kind of a question that you could ask. Why do we workers put up with it? Well, by suppressing class consciousness and encouraging false consciousness is what someone who is deeply steeped in the Marxist theory would say. Fortunately, I like to define things so that you can actually understand what the heck that means. So, class consciousness is a condition of realizing that workers and bosses are not on the same side, and that bosses cannot achieve their goals without the workers, right? There are so many more of us than there are the bosses. Yes, they're in charge, but who says, right? If we all get together and realize that the workers are on one side and the hyper rich on the other, we could change the whole system, but we don't. What's keeping us from doing that? Social structures. False consciousness, then, is a lack of class consciousness. So thinking that the employer and the employee are on the same side, that's false consciousness. When false consciousness is present, it must be overcome before class consciousness is developed. And bosses absolutely know this. We see this in modern union busting techniques. I actually studied this as part of my master's thesis, was looking at the strategies used by bosses to try to prevent unions from organizing. Walmart was infamous for years and years. I don't think they still do it. They might do it in isolated areas of having like a little pep rally at the beginning of every single shift to give the workers the feeling that them and the bosses and the management are all on the same side in the store. That Marx would say is absolutely an example of false consciousness. Let's look at some of the interpretations of how law and policy act on the macro level, as we've been kind of discussing. So lawmakers have not entirely ignored observations of social scientists regarding poverty. Attempts have been made to use both law and policy to alleviate poverty. Let's define those terms. Law is defined as the official rules that have been approved by legislatures, so Congress, and approved by executives, i.e. governors and presidents. Policy, then, are the ways that laws are enforced and enacted after they've been put into place. So things can be law, and that's legally what we're supposed to do, but that may or may not be how policy, how they actually are enforced goes. So for example, it could be the law that cannabis possession is punished by a minimum of a $20 fine or a 5-year prison sentence maximum. But the sheriff may make a policy decision that his officers will only issue the minimum punishment for this crime, i.e. the $20 fine, right? So those who are in charge of enforcement can, within the scope of the law, decide how much they're going to actually enforce it. There have been two major interpretations of law and policy surrounding poverty. And outside of functionalist or conflict theory interpretations, these tend to be a little bit more academic. Basically, these are kind of the terms that we generally use. So Big Brother interpretation is for the one group of policy, and the other is distribution of welfare resources interpretation, which is the other. These are basically the two different ways that we in American society have attempted to try to deal with poverty. The so-called Big Brother interpretation, which is the more conservative interpretation, states that social policies attempting to alleviate poverty are misguided and making poverty actually worse. Thus, people in desperate situations may fall back on safety nets and not actually try to make their position better. This idea then is that if we give people money, if we don't let people just starve to death, they will stop working. You can classify this mode of thinking as a type of social Darwinism, thus stating that people should be made to suffer so that they can try to work harder, and if they don't suffer, they won't even try to work. This is not really backed by social scientific evidence. There are countries, and I believe we've talked about this already in this class, there are countries that give a kind of a standard minimum pay to all citizens. So no matter what, all citizens are guaranteed a base amount of money per month. I think it's hovers around somewhere near $1,000, but it could be more than that. Basically, their idea is everyone deserves a certain amount of sustainability. The American idea basically is that starvation, I guess, and not having anything should be a threat to make people keep working. This philosophy, the Big Brother interpretation, has a very long history. It can be traced back to a philosopher named Alexis de Tocqueville, and he lived in 1835. He claimed that any measure which establishes legal charity on a permanent basis and gives it an administrative form thereby creates an idle and lazy class, living at the expense of the industrial working class. De Tocqueville is an interesting historic character. Somehow he managed to not get his head chopped off in the French Revolution, basically by pretending to be the philosopher that he claimed to have been, as opposed to just a hyper-rich person in aristocratic France. This interpretation was picked up by Republicans in the 1980s in their attempts to undo measures put into place by the War on Poverty. In 1980, when he was running for president, Ronald Reagan said, "We fought a war on poverty, and poverty won." So the war on poverty were measures that were taken by President Johnson, and he was trying basically to minimize poverty as much as he possibly could in the United States. What Reagan is saying here is that all of those efforts really were a waste of time and made us weaker as a society as a whole, is the position Reagan would have taken. So from that perspective, eliminating social service programs was the way to eliminate poverty. So we eliminate welfare programs, and if we do that, somehow people won't be poor anymore. Without assistance from the government, the poor will be forced to work their way out of poverty, the whole bootstraps argument bit. And to maintain the fear of poverty, we need a portion of the population to always be poor. And so from this philosophical mindset, we will always have poverty because we need to have poverty to keep people working. That's that whole set of ideas. The distribution of welfare resource interpretation, which is the more progressive interpretation, takes a more internationalist approach by comparing poverty across countries. So really, if you take the Big Brother approach, and really that name Big Brother is criticizing what are considered welfare programs, and we discussed earlier that there's nothing called welfare, that's just kind of a general term that was used. This approach really looks at other countries outside of the United States, the welfare resources approach, and actually looks at countries that actually tries to do these things to figure out what might actually happen. Evidence is an amazing thing. If we compare countries with strong welfare states, such as Germany, Sweden, and Denmark, to those with less developed welfare states, such as the United States, we will find actually lower rates of poverty in the strong welfare states, the strong welfare countries. The key to doing this is proper funding, right? The reason why our food stamp programs, our TANF programs, all of those other programs that are set up to help poor people, the reason why they don't work is because they don't get enough funding, right? This position is backed up by data presented in our textbook on page 25. Oh, I'm sorry, we don't use that textbook anymore. This data is backed up by social scientific data. And you can definitely find it. If you want me to look some up for you, send me an email. I'll do that, no problem. And so from this perspective, it may be possible to eliminate poverty with a well-funded, state-sponsored welfare system. So basically, if we want to try to eliminate poverty in the United States, we have to pay our taxes, is really what it comes down to. And not only do we have to pay our taxes, but we have to make sure that tax money is going to the right places, which is all quite difficult. And that's it for this lecture. If you have any questions, please send me an email.